I once had the opportunity to query a former Fed member about how they see the other banks' actions to be directing the ones of the Fed. And I got a very strange American answer: the Fed doesn't care about it. Well, I beg to differ, and so this is why I think the Fed will very quickly change the interest rates soon, in the weeks coming, but for the wrong reason. To show that they're independent, also mechanically, because it is true that the US macroeconomic indicators are favorable, but then I think it will only be one or two steps, and that very quickly the Fed will be caught up with the economic reality in the other places of the world, and all the liquidity that keeps on pouring there in Japan, in Europe, and in China, as a matter of fact, as well.
Richard, I saw you nodding when when we revealed some of the results there. Which one really caught your attention, if anything? The 39-40% saying slowing China. Well, the biggest risk.
Obviously, China is the biggest thing that's bothering most world businesses right now. I mean, there's only, I think, two things that matter in the global economy: US monetary policy and the Chinese economy. And there's a lot of uncertainty about both of those. And I think, certainly from a fund manager's point of view, if we had greater clarity around those two things, if you thought dollar stable, China stable, I'd be pretty happy as an investor. When you have rising dollar, weakening China, that's a pretty tough environment, certainly from an emerging market investor's point of view.
Tell me about China and how it affects your business.
I think on China, what I've learned is you have to have a very differentiated view. So one province is not another one. And when it comes to GDP as well, we tend to want to measure the Chinese economy with this derivative indicator, which is a currency or a monetary value of the GDP growth. Now, if I were to use an engineer's metric for a moment and say, let's measure the economic activity by the input of power, then we would see that 2015 is almost at par of 2014, which is the first time in history. So that would almost mean that from that metric you conclude that either there's no growth in economic activity, or that it is more efficient and that it is different in structure. I think we really have to realize, as we know, that the structure of GDP is changing in China, as the leadership wants. And so you have to put this into perspective. So this metric that measures GDP growth, but it is now measuring something which is different in nature, that's already a first thing. Then there is a refreshing thing. If GDP per unit of energy input is actually increasing, that means the economy is becoming more efficient. And as we all know, it has to become more efficient because it wasn't really sustainable in the past with the use of natural resources. And that gives very balancing impacts to our business. So on one side, of course, output of what we have now under coal production will be reduced in volume. But on the other side, this creates great opportunities to invest in renewable infrastructure. And we're pretty active in that. And I think this is going to be, in part, actually one of the drivers of economy as well.
Let me finish off on these Paris talks. I know that Richard Lancaster is there for those talks. Will they amount to anything? Nothing in the past is really stuck, right?
But you remember, Bernie, in the past, they got stuck because people wanted to agree on specific targets and how to control them and who would have the right to impose what on whom. I think, as we see this morning in the newspaper as well, as Mr. Modi said, people need to come up with their voluntary targets. They have to take their own moral responsibility, taking into account the past and the status of their economy. And I think from that perspective, it's refreshing to see that there is a willingness, and that already China, US, and others have come up with voluntary targets. Now, the sum of those voluntary targets probably won't do it when it comes to capping the 2% growth, 2% temperature increase, and so we will need other processes. But I'd rather be an optimist and say when people voluntarily talk about a common goal, that's probably better than when they quarrel about who has a right to impose what.
Richard, last word to you. Why don't we end on the environment?
I agree with that point that China's use of energy in the past has been very inefficient. That's unsustainable, and actually you're going to see China and I think the rest of the emerging world leapfrog the first world and be much, much more efficient in their use of energy, and that's a very positive thing.